Welcome to episode 15 of the Liberty Itch podcast. My guest today is former Queensland Premier Campbell Newman. In 2012, Campbell did for Queensland what desperately needs to be done for all of Australia. He downsized the government bureaucracy, reduced government spending, balanced the budget, and simultaneously achieved huge, measured improvements in government frontline service delivery through increased efficiency. Can-do Campbell proved it can be done. He proved that government does not need to suck quite so badly. But despite incredible quantified success, Queenslanders threw Campbell out at the next election. Having eviscerated Labor by 78 seats to 7 in 2012, just 3 years later, Queenslanders resurrected the Labor swamp goblins that had mismanaged the state for the previous 23 years and gave control back to them. You do not need to know what happened to know what happened. Labor added back more new bureaucrats than Campbell had cut, returned the budget to deficit, and continued saddling Queenslanders with crippling unproductive government debt. Which begs the question, why? Why would they turn away from positive performance to return to the incompetence that they had just escaped? Did Queenslanders have Stockholm syndrome? Or do people become addicted to the stress of Albanese-level incompetent governance in the same way that gamblers become addicted to the high of losing rather than winning? Does a society need to reach Venezuelan or Argentinian levels of dystopic misery before accepting that the only solution to the problem of government is getting rid of government? Or did Campbell do something so catastrophically bad that it was preferable to return the state to the unsustainable path that all of Australia is now on? Mr. Can-do Campbell Newman, welcome to the Liberty Itch podcast. Thank you for joining us.
Great to be with you, Damon. This is quite novel. Yeah, particularly knowing where you're located, but yeah.
Tbilisi to Australia.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's a bit different, yeah.
You look like you're in the next room.
Now, what I really wanted to talk to you about, as I said earlier, is you managed to downsize government remarkably successfully in your time. It's May 2025. I just want to give a little bit of context to, for the future, where we're coming from. Australia, the World Bank just recently found, has the most bloated bureaucracy in the world, with almost 15% of the population employed by the public service. It's also the fastest growing in the world. We've got the fastest declining standard of living in the OECD. The leading cause of death in 15 to 44-year-olds in Australia is currently suicide. We have real incomes down 8% in the last couple of years. That's the worst in the OECD. 5% drop in productivity since Albo came to power, with productivity dropping every quarter for the last 5 quarters. I could go on and on. Things are bad. In 2012, you took over in an absolute unbelievable record-setting landslide victory over Labor, who'd been in power in Queensland for 23 years at the time. They had $84 billion in debt. There was issues with crime. All of the issues that we face right now were basically facing you back in 2012. You came into power, 220,000 public servants full-time working for the Queensland State Government at that time. And you came in and you managed to actually reduce the government spending in the first year there. You very famously cut 14,000 staff, which, from what I understand, was primarily from voluntary redundancies and just not renewing existing contracts, letting them expire, with a handful of actual sackings in there. And you got voted in for this. I was there. I remember this. You got voted in for this because the state needed it. Things were a disaster. You successfully did this. You managed to reduce crime by 20%. You managed to improve the hospital waiting times to the best in the country, from being an absolute basket case there as well. We could go on. You succeeded outrageously, and they crucified you for it at the next election, wiping out the record-setting win that you'd had previously. What the hell happened, and why would they do that on the basis of what you did?
Look, there's a range of reasons, and thanks for the intro. And I think you've done your work. Look, I think the first thing is that we didn't run a good campaign in 2015, which saw us hosed out of office. We didn't run a good campaign, having said that, the narrative since that time about what happened is really quite problematic, because I think it's led the LNP, to actually come up with the wrong way of campaigning, and even what they're attempting to do in government in this state. And what I mean by that is this: you've got to look at the numbers. The primary vote, when we got voted out, was 41.3%. Okay, painted as a huge disaster. Well, David Crucifixion, who was one of my ministers, just got elected as the Premier of Queensland late last year. Primary vote, 41.5. 20 basis points higher, right? So it's about how preferences work. It's about where the votes fall. Now, I should say that Crucifixion and the LNP should have won with a primary vote of 45 or 46, because the government they were up against were, doing a bad job and quite unpopular.
Yeah, they've done the same thing.
But you then contrast that to what's just happened with Peter Dutton, where when I last checked, the primary vote done was about 35% for the Liberal National Party in the state of Queensland. So, people really marked them down. So what are my thoughts? Well, the 2015 campaign was a lousy campaign, but it wasn't as bad as the campaign the coalition just ran across Australia. We had too many controversies while we were in office. We blundered into some fights that we really didn't need to have. And I guess the Labor Party were able to very effectively do a couple of things. One was to just paint this picture of controversy, but also then continue the political sort of assassination of my character. And that's a tried and true technique, which they've used on Tony Abbott and now Peter Dutton. When we ran the 2015 campaign, we failed to remind people about why they put us there. We failed to remind them that the Labor Party had really run the state into the ground, that the debt was going through the roof. Things like the Queensland Health payroll debacle, where nurses and doctors weren't being paid, or being paid on, twice for doing the same, couple of weeks' work. So we failed to actually remind people, and we didn't run a negative campaign against Labor. The rest is history. So, yes, it was significant from the point of view we'd had a big majority, but I actually look at it and think, well, we had a lot of controversy over 3 years, and to only lose narrowly like that after the way that that things had played out, well, it was a near-run thing. One other thing, and I'm going to sound like someone who's whinging a bit, but the media up here were very supportive of the Australian Labor Party and very, very much about doing everything they could to bring the self of the government down. And so we found ourselves inevitably fighting with, it was us versus the ALP and the unions and interest groups supported by the media. So that's what happened. But the sort of what the LNP have taken from that is, well, we won't try we won't try reform. We won't actually try to sort out the problems. We won't make the case. We won't try and explain why we have to make tough decisions. And that's dead wrong, mate.
Absolutely, it's dead wrong. The resounding negativity about your time in office, though, is all centered around these 14,000 people that you got rid of. That and I was going to get to it later, but I'm gathering that was basically a media beat up, because they were saying things such as you just went and took a machete to the frontline staff, when in fact you hired, I think it was 1,100 extra police officers. You brought crime down statistically by up to 20%. And then, as I said before, you got the lowest hospital waiting times, emergency times and surgery times in the country, which I was living in Queensland. I remember Queensland Health, and they were atrocious at everything. So it was a hell of an achievement. How do they do this? Because this is a big problem. This was a national problem where the media does definitely sit, well, they're very much on the left. They beat up on the right, but they can take something that seems to be a positive achievement like that and turn it around somehow. Can you speak to that?
Well, I suppose at the end of the day, you know, myself as the leader and the party themselves, the members of the party, I mean, we've got to take responsibility for that. I mean, you just have to be really on your game and relentless and always pushing back. And even today, I push back when I'm questioned with this, and people say, well, you sacked 14,000. I say, well, okay, yeah, 14,000 was the number in terms of downsizing the public sector. But it wasn't done through just sacking people. It was done through redundancies, as you've said, and letting people on contracts go, not renewing. But yeah, the Labor Party have a great way of constantly pushing that, and I guess we allowed them ultimately to reinforce that negative. I actually think at the time of the election, Damien, it wasn't as significant as people say. It's more than that. It's that and that and that and that. It's a series of things.
Of course.
Any one of which would, if it had been removed, would have made the difference. So, for example, if we hadn't had a controversy over the appointment of a new Chief Justice, we would have won. If we hadn't had the Deputy Premier lose his head and while I was overseas on a family holiday decide, while he had the reins as Premier, he decided to give politicians a massive pay rise. And I can assure people I never went into politics to policy. Well, it was just, he thought he was smart because he thought he had the agreement of the opposition headed by Anastasia Palaszczuk. Of course, the moment the proverbial hit the fan when the media were going, well, how come politicians are getting big pay rise? Suddenly Anastasia was nowhere to be seen to back the pay rise she'd agreed to. So, any of those things, if they hadn't been there, we would have got back in. And so again, I think the thing we need to focus on now is what is the opportunity for centre-right parties to actually undertake reform and to be responsible. And if we then talk about the recent federal election campaign, the thing that's driving me nuts, Damon, is the way that people are taking the wrong lessons for that. And I, as someone who's had a lot dumped on me personally, I'm not here to dump on Peter Dutton. So let's just keep it sort of more general about what they did wrong. They didn't go to them. Well, they didn't. Yeah. The Liberal National Party did not lurch to the right. And we now have a leader, Susan Lee, who's implying that they need to come to the left, which is ridiculous. Look, here's what should have happened. There are the principles of the Liberal Party, and there are things like, support for small business and private enterprise and reward for personal aspiration and minimal government and low taxes. That should translate into a vision for the election campaign, and then down by that is then, this is our plan, and these are the announceables, these are the policies we take to the people. And they needed 18 months ago to be out with the vision and then the plan and then the announceables. And then it would have been a coherent, clear vision and plan that actually made sense. Instead, what we got was a disjointed series of announcements late in the day that failed to resonate with people. We lost, for example, some of the largest expat communities that should have been on board. For example, I firmly believe people from India and people from China or Taiwan or Hong Kong who've come to Australia, they're in the main very business oriented. They believe in family. They believe in what I'd call values of respect and the need for I suppose order in society. They are natural supporters of the Liberal Party, and yet somehow they've deserted the Liberal Party. So the combination of all that, plus the overlay of this campaign of denigration and demonisation of Peter Dutton, meant it was a complete shambles of a campaign and a wipeout. Now there was I forget the gent's name, but he stood up he was the ALP campaign manager in the last week or so. He's been at the National Press Club and he said, look, this is how we beat him. Well, fair enough. But I'll say this, he didn't win it, because the primary vote of the Labor Party barely went blip. What happened was the primary vote for the coalition just fragmented right across the right. So One Nation, Family First, Trumpet of Patriots with Clive Palmer, the Libertarian Party, which I'm a member, we did very badly, and we need to reflect on that. But the point is it fragmented to the right because traditional Liberal Party supporters just went, oh, I can't support these guys. And that's the problem. So I've sort of pretty much told you what I think we need to do on the right, and we can put up a vision, an alternative vision for this country, and we should explain to people that they're being sold a real dud by the Labor Party, and that socialism is not the way to go. And extreme socialism is now where we're going. Where we are not going to get Australia out of the jam. You talked about all the problems. We won't fix that by higher taxes, by killing aspiration, by driving away people, with get up and go and nous to other countries. I mean, it won't happen. We will continue to spiral in. And I'm quite worried about the future of Australia. I think we are a nation in decline now. And I have no pleasure in saying that.
No, and there's a lot of talk about it being managed decline, which is certainly what it looks like. There's no attempt to actually bring it back, it would seem, from either Liberal or Labor, which, as you say, the Liberal campaign was effectively what people called it, Labor light. They just went with whatever Labor was doing, which I tend to agree is exactly the wrong direction, and we only need to look all over Europe to see everybody's lurching to the right to get away from this socialist hell that we're heading towards.
Well, and Australia's so clearly behind the eight ball, it's extraordinary. You haven't asked about the Trump effect in terms of the election, and maybe that had some.
What do you think?
Maybe that had some impact. I mean, I was really pleased when Donald Trump was elected, not because I liked Donald Trump's style, but I thought he would plough through and cut through a whole lot of this, DEI stuff and ESG and net zero and a whole lot of these crazy things, which, I suppose he is doing. But the way that he's gone about the last sort of 3 months has really concerned me. And I think that's, it's played out badly in Australia. So maybe it had an impact. But again, why would Peter Dutton be automatically tarred and feathered with Donald Trump? I mean, that's crazy. And that's the fault of the Liberal National Party for allowing that to be laid at their door.
But this is my main question for you: is as somebody, the last I recall, who was actually able to cut the size of the public sector and the spending to a degree. They somehow still used it against you, and again, the Australian populace voted for more of the last 23 years that had led them into the hole that they were already in.
Well, we're not joining the dots.
What do you tell the next guy?
Yeah. Well, I think straight away, and I go back to what I said about the timing of what the coalition needed to do in the lead up to the election that's just passed. It's not something you can do in an election campaign. And what happened was that, Peter Dutton had gone quite well up until about Australia Day this year. And I think he'd done that simply, probably in a way, pointing out the deficiencies of the government. But then there was a void where there was not content out there about what they would do. And that content also depended on an explanation of what's going wrong. I mean, we need to tell Australians that the cost of living crisis has been caused by government. And it's been caused by policies like pursuing net zero. Because if you want to know why your water bill's gone up, it's because of net zero type policies and the cost of electricity. If you want to know why your power bill's gone up, it's because of a reckless approach to getting rid of coal-fired power and having to put in renewables, and that's come at great expense. If you want to know why your groceries cost more, it's because of all the constraints that are put on the free market, the cost of building new shopping centres, the cost of the rent that then flows through, the taxes and charges that governments put on retailers, the cost of buying a truck, the cost of operating a truck. It goes on and on and on. That's what, if you want to know why your latte coffee and your scrambled eggs, your local restaurant or cafe costs so much, it's because of penalty rates that are crazy, by world standards. It's all that. And so, well, look, fine. If Australia wants that, well, okay, go in with your eyes open. But I think there's an opportunity to explain to the community the folly of a whole range of these things. And that's what the housing crisis drives me bonkers, because again, governments restricted the supply of land and made it expensive to build out in horizontally on green space. Governments constrained how high developers can go. Governments then said, that you've got to design the universal design. So like every house now, it seems, has to be built for someone in a wheelchair. Now, if someone is disabled or their family is looking for a home for them, then there will be people in the private sector who will build such a home. But the cost of that is now being put on everybody. Damon, once upon a time, we didn't have smoke detectors in this country. Then they were the wrong smoke detectors. Sorry, then we had to have smoke detectors, and we went with that. Then the smoke detectors they legislated for were the wrong ones, so we needed new types of smoke detectors, which are more expensive, and now they have to be hardwired in. That's just an example which adds thousands of dollars to the cost of new home. So at the end of the day, the cost of housing is a supply issue, and the costs imposed by government on society, and we're excluding all these young people from the market. So, and of course, we've got an overlay. We're bringing all these people in, but so there's the demand. But government could really.
We saw why in the election
supporting this thing. So, we've got to tell people. We've got to explain it. We need people, great communicators like Matt Canavan, who I think can communicate. People like Senator Antic down in South Australia, who's great at communicating these things and has the guts. And as Peter Credlin, a colleague of mine on Sky News, says, you'll never win an argument if you're not prepared to have it.
Exactly. Well, speaking to that, with the green agenda, which is causing so many problems and rippling through so many parts of the economy, obviously, when you were mayor, one of your achievements was in the green area. I couldn't quite ascertain exactly what it was that you did, but I did want to ask you about what the pressures are internally to do these sorts of things, to jump on board with these programs. What did you do? Why did you do it?
Okay. Well, I suppose the first thing is a bit of context, Damon. Cities around the world are inherently left-wing in terms of their voting trends.
Yes.
And, we're seeing that with the phenomenon of the teals, for example, but that's been around for ages. So, you look at the United States, you look at the European experience, cities tend to be left-wing. Now, Queensland is a conservative blue-collar state, and outside the inner core of Brisbane, you get, becomes inherently blue-collar and conservative as well. But my success as a Lord Mayor, and I was a very successful mayor in terms of political success and popularity.
Shortlisted for 2010 World Mayor.
So what did we do? Well, we deliberately said, we're going to have policies that will be, whilst we were building infrastructure for cars, like new bridges and tunnels and the like, not just going with the public transport dogma, we were building lots of new buses. We did take a bus fleet in a subtropical city that I think only had about 30% of it was air conditioned. We took it to over 95% of it by the time I finished as mayor. So why wouldn't you have air conditioned buses in a city like this? But then we had a lot of programs that were about community involvement and buy-in. So we had a thing called Green Heart City Hub. That whole program was about greening Brisbane. So it was about working on or building on the work of previous administrations with the greening of Brisbane. So handing out trees to residents to plant in their gardens.
Okay.
It was about a commitment. Like in the 2008 election, we said we will plant 2 million trees in the next 4 years. 2 million trees around the city of Brisbane, inside our local government area. So we created these little mini forests, and we went and did it. It was fantastic. We had community events where people got to do that. We had sustainability fairs. And so, I guess one regret I'd have today is back then, to be honest about it, I'd sort of bought into the whole climate change thing. Today, I am now a climate change skeptic. Okay. Back then, the way I used to talk to people was,
welcome to the team.
You don't have to believe in climate change, but surely one thing we can all agree on is to tread perhaps a little lightly less heavily on the earth, but tread lightly on the earth. Absolutely. In other words, let's try and reduce our usage of water and electricity and all those sort of things. So that's something you get the head nod on, and that went down well. It appealed to your blue collar conservative people. It appealed to your retirees, and it appealed to natural, Greens or ALP voters, and we got support there. So it was a politically pragmatic thing to do, but it
was a positive thing.
Well, it was a positive thing.
Increase your electricity power and.
Well, it was about improving the livability of the city. It was about green spaces and protecting the environment, protecting flora and fauna. So we even had. Okay. I don't know if you can see it, and it's probably out of camera view, but I've got a cartoon around here on the wall.
Yeah,
one of our budgets, which we announced we were going to have a native animal ambulance. So that was just a small amount of money. I think it was only about $20,000 or $30,000 a year. And what it was, well, if there's a dead animal on the footpath, you ring the council and someone will come and pick up the body, the carcass, and take it away. Well, if you see an injured one, what do? And how about we try and nurse them back? If it's a koala or if it's a possum, you want to try and save it. Although the possums at my place seem to be doing okay without any government support.
Just bounce back by themselves.
There's plenty of them. So that's what that was all about, and that was political pragmatism.
Completely different animal. Yeah. Okay then. So then, one of the other things related to that's a different case, obviously. As an outsider, not that interested on being on the inside of politics, we hear about the chicanery and backstabbing and nonsense that goes on in there. You were a target and a half in your time. Can you give us a sense of what? I mean, you were a Liberal man going into a Labor lion's den, really. I mean, 22, 23 years of Labor. The bureaucracy's built up around you. They're all Laborites. I know. I was in IT firms at the time, so I would meet with these people. And how did you get anything done? How do you have any stories of situations where you came out of the room with the 35 knives in your back? What does it look like for an average person to understand?
I'm not sure that I really do have too many stories. It was a very, it was 3 years, but it went very, very quickly. And I guess what I was doing as Premier through the Cabinet, through the ministers and their offices, it was just I was driving change. And we clearly had resistance in some areas. And some areas, we didn't get reform at all. I don't think we got much reform in the Department of Education. I don't think we got reform in the Department of Transport and Main Roads.
Okay, if I can stop you there, sorry, but that's sort of it. Why not? How is it that the chief can't get the change done?
Well, because you've got you're there at the top of a very large organisation, and you've got people down through the layers who actively will work against initiatives. And I'll give you an example, which I've seen played out in other governments. And a government gets in and says, "Okay, we want to make savings," and says, "Well, we can't touch frontline services," and so the ministers get told to go to their departments, and the departments get told provide savings. Well, it's like there's an old Yes Minister show on this, where essentially they put up, proposals which either can't be accepted or they have little mini nukes embedded in them that blow up, and they never hurt. So they'll never downsize head office, like as they say, George Street, Brisbane is the centre of government. They'll never downsize there. They'll always hurt frontline services. And if you've got smart, really capable ministers who are capable of diving down and properly running their departments instead of being political show ponies, then you actually will have a better go at getting reform, because those ministers will actually ask the right questions, delve into the nooks and crannies, and work out what's going on. But sadly, there's so many people these days in politics who, look, I don't know why they're there, Damon. I don't know. They don't seem to really want to get things done.
Well,
they certainly don't want to create waves, and if you don't create waves, you're not going to get anything done. And so our politicians think it's all about new programs, more money, as opposed to actually driving change and effective, delivery of government services.
So that's what I'm trying to ascertain: is the problem bottom up or is it top down? I would have thought, in the private sector, if I'm the CEO or if I'm the COO, if I go into an area and I go, you're going to cut these staff, then they cut the staff. But it seems in government it doesn't work that way, which is just, how does somebody in a hierarchy beneath the person above them just say no to the order?
Well, it
doesn't work in the army. It doesn't work in.
Well, it's not so much that they say no, mate. It's that they just have a delaying and stalling tactic. So I had a minister in particular, for example, who was given a program of where they had to. Let's probably be careful here about how I explain this, but there was like an operational arm in the department, and then there was like the infrastructure bit. And what the minister was told to do by cabinet, not just by me, but their instructions were, what you're going to do is this infrastructure bit has to be separated off so that then not only government can use that infrastructure, but the private sector can use it as well. Essentially, like, just imagine it's offices and halls and training rooms across the state of Queensland. So they were meant to be made available for anybody to use for a fee and run on as commercial a basis as possible. Well, what happened was this part of it delayed. This organisation was set up, but this mob here deliberately slow rolled the whole thing. And so by the time we got voted out, it hadn't happened. Another example is the state of Queensland owns a lot of land. It owns land everywhere. And in the inner north of Brisbane, where I reside, there's homes in suburbia, in suburbs like Wooloowin and Clayfield, that were owned at the time by the Department of Main Roads, well, by government, for the Department of Main Roads. And those houses had been bought in the late 60s, early 70s, mid-70s, for the purposes of a new motorway that was meant to be carved through suburbia. Now, that was obviously a bad idea. But what happened was, in the 2000s, what did we do? We built the Airport Link Tunnel. So there's never going to be a freeway through there. They don't need those homes. They were meant to be sold off. We told them to sell them off. I can tell you now they'd sold bugger all by the time I left office. The Airport Link Tunnel was finished prior to 2012, and they were no longer required. But it's like these people, it's like, oh, we can't do that. And these idiot politicians, we might need them one day, so they won't do it. And they deliberately delay.
So you're sitting on millions of dollars worth of property.
Millions of dollars worth of property.
For absolutely nothing.
It's like the Catholic Church cries poor, but cries poor, going to maybe a controversial area, more the Catholic Church cries poor, but it's got property all over the place, which is sitting there tonight. I could take you, here I'm at 20 to 7 on a Brisbane evening. I could take you within 10 minutes drive of here, I could take you to multiple different Catholic Church assets that are locked up and dark, haven't been used today, won't be used tomorrow. And so it's just another bureaucracy, and that's what's happening. The balance sheet is a lazy balance sheet in terms of the Queensland State Government. And at the end of the day, if they use the assets properly, if they made use of them or divested them, taxpayers would be getting a better run.
Then where does accountability come in? Or is that just a stupid question?
Well, that's one of the things we were trying to do, is we wanted accountability. And I'll give you an example. I mentioned earlier in this talk about having too many fights. So an example of a fight that we blundered into, but we probably needed to have, was we had a big fight with the doctors in the public health system. What was the fight about? The fight was about getting them to be on employment contracts. Just ponder that for a sec. They doctors employed.
Yep.
There was no framework, no contractual framework for their employment. And, what we'd found, sadly, was that the doctors, many doctors, well, most doctors are doing the right thing, but there were people who were doing the wrong thing. There were people...
So they were just invoicing the government for what they felt like.
Well, we found, and this has been this is a matter of the public record, it's been the Courier Mail, we had doctors who were clocking on at the Royal Brisbane Hospital, and then going off and playing golf, and their colleagues were covering for them. We had doctors who were clocking on, and it was suggested because of the stupid payroll system that the Labor Party had stuffed up, they would then go to another hospital, being the PA on the south side, and clock on again, draw two lots of pay. So there were rorts, there was feather bedding, there were things going on. And so we wanted to get better management of our hospitals to get better health outcomes. I mean, another example, by the way, would be you've got an operating theatre in a public hospital, and in a given, say, 8-hour period, you might have been doing certain surgery, and you might get, in that 8-hour period, you might get 5 of these particular types of surgery. Like it could be cataracts, it could be knee operations or something like that. It doesn't really matter, but I'm just trying to give you a sort of a contrived example.
Sure.
So in that particular operating theatre, they'd get 5 of these procedures through in a day, in an 8-hour day. But you also had doctors who had the right of private practice in those same hospitals. So they were paid by the public system, but they had a right to do private practice as well. And so they had private patients who had paid private health insurance. In that same operating theatre, you get 8 or 9 of those same procedures through when it was a private list. And why is that? It's because they got paid, because they wanted no slip-ups. They were hustle, hustle, hustle. I want the anaesthetist here. I want the scrub nurse. I want this organised. I've got to get them through because it's all about the money. Yeah. That's unacceptable. It really is. And so we had to go in and make doctors accountable in the public health system. And basically there was this huge blood, huge controversy. And I'll make the point that if you're a politician and you're having a political fight, you don't have a fight with a doctor. Because on the scale of respect in the professions, doctors are up here and politicians are down there. But I just say, Damon, if the public only knew,
why don't they? That's what I want to ask. This is the sort of stuff we know. This is throughout government.
Doctor, good guy, politician, crook.
Sure.
Okay.
But if this particular doctor's a bad guy, I mean, surely it would be, you need to scapegoat somebody to just go, hey, this happens. Here's a guy who did it.
Yeah. Well,
what do you suggest?
Well, we tried to explain, and I mentioned before the Courier Mail covered stories. We exposed some of the rorts and that sort of stuff. But again, we probably should have done a better job of piling that on. And I say we blundered into the fight because the health minister being, Lawrence Springborg is now the president of the LNP, so he's not in Parliament. He's the mayor of the Goondiwindi Regional Council. I mean, I think, he didn't plan this industrial relations fight, and it didn't play out well, and it occupied a lot of time and effort, and the government lost a lot of bark in the process. So if you're going to have these big reform fights, you got to plan them properly. And I'm the first one to say that we had fights that weren't planned, that we just blundered into them, and when you blundered into them, it doesn't play out well. Yeah.
So, have you been watching the DOGE debacle in the US with Elon Musk? Have you been paying any attention to that?
I certainly had been paying attention at the beginning, yeah. So I think that was the right way to go. That was the right way to expose the issues. Probably, my thoughts there would be, you've got to relentlessly expose these things, and they were doing that. But you can't just immediately hit it hard, and you've got to have a steady game plan where you gradually deal with it. I think because you really can create a huge furor, and like when there's a political fight and you're in government, the incumbent government suffers. They really do. They actually do. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. They just almost as a fact of life, they lose ground. They lose bark.
Is it I don't know if it's uniquely Australian, but is it an Australian quality? Because I still can't make sense of this. There's such obvious waste, fraud, and abuse within the government. We all pay for it. Well, not me anymore, but sorry. But we all pay for it, and yet it seems whenever anybody does try to come in and actually do something about it, that there is this massive pushback. I understand the media is very leftist and always tries to find the negative in it. But is it an Australian thing? And I guess the ultimate question for the whole interview is, what would you suggest? How do we get around this and, when back in power in some way, start to undo the ludicrousness of the situation?
Well, I think Australians are inherently socialist in their outlook, more so than other countries like, say, well, look, they're socialist compared to the United States. I think they are. And they sadly have this vision of themselves as being resilient, freedom-loving, poking fun at government, all that stuff. I think that's a falsehood now. I really do. And COVID showed us that. They were, I'm afraid, compliant and really led up the garden path by bureaucrats and politicians. But so I think it's inherently much harder in this country than it might be in the United States. I think as well there's another issue in that people here for forever have looked suspiciously at people who've done well in business. So United States, might be there's the guy in the fancy car. People in America might
the tall poppy
go, well, hey, how do I get that? In Australia, it's more, well, how did that bastard sort of get that, and how can we take it off? Done something wrong. So there are those sort of things. But like, what do we need to do? Well, try and give you the whole sort of thing now. Okay, the first thing is the Liberal and National parties need to be in coalition. Secondly, they need to put their arms out as wide as they can. And I've lost it from the screen, from the camera, but they've got to reach out and try and bring people in the fold. Back in 1944, that's what Menzies did to form the Liberal Party. And it has to be the case that we've got to, and this is probably against the Libertarian Party, which I'm a member, but people have got to be brought into the fold, and we need unity. Therefore, those parties also need to be run in a way which actually is truly about a broad church. I mean, the Liberal National Party wouldn't have me, and there are many other people who have essentially been cast out because their views are unpalatable. The next thing is,
if I can interrupt you on that point, though, would you, in terms of casting that net wide, do you believe that it should be cast wide on staying true to an ideology, saying this is what we represent and what we're about, take it or leave it, or go the way the leftists are already saying, which is just bend the knee to absolutely everybody because we need to try to be as inclusive as we possibly can?
Well, it should be out wide, but this is the beauty of looking at principles, statements of values or principles. They're there on the Liberal Party website right now today. If they go to those
and live by them.
And live by them and create a vision for Australia based on those principles, and then a plan and policies that plug in to all that, they can win. They absolutely can win. And I mentioned the Indian and Chinese expat communities that are here. They can win with those people. It's there for the taking. I mean, to be critical of individuals, I don't think Susan Lee believes in that stuff. Prove me wrong. Jane Hume, Senator Jane Hume for Victoria. This is an individual who, when she was a minister in, I think, the Turnbull government, drove with Josh Frydenberg, who everyone thinks is great, drove small businesses out of business, and I'm referring to financial advisors. Wouldn't listen. These were people who were actually Liberal National Party supporters who were driven out of business because the government and Jane Hume as a relevant minister and Josh Frydenberg, just so comprehensively got it wrong. They had a royal commission into the banks. The judge, who was non-commercial, who doesn't get the private sector, ended up making recommendations which let the banks off scot-free, in my humble opinion. But finance brokers and financial advisors got it in the neck. The judge didn't like conflicted advice. He said that has to be banned. And so financial advisors, when they were now then talking to their clients, had to say, well, we're going to charge you an upfront fee. And what does that mean, Damon? It means the mums and dads, the people who need financial advice, can't afford financial advice. Okay? It meant that financial advisors were told, you've got to go and do training and you've got to do courses. So these were people who'd been maybe working in the industry for 40 years and had tertiary qualifications and subsequent qualifications as well. But they were told, you've got to retrain. You've got to go back to school. And they all went, too hard. Raft of new regulations, statements of advice, paperwork. Like what bullshit coming from a Liberal government? And I'm in
especially
business.
from the Liberals.
Well, I'm in business, and I now have, what we've done is we've made people who own Xero very wealthy, and MYOB very wealthy. Why do I say that? Because once upon a time, you didn't have to pay someone $50, $80 a month, that range, to have a subscription to a software service, so you could then ultimately lodge your payroll with the ATO. But now that's what we've all got to do. And that was a Liberal National Party government. We've got anti-money laundering laws that are like bags of iron filings dropped in the gearbox of the economy in a futile attempt to try and catch the crooks. The crooks are still in business.
Yep.
But now we're all running around basically IDing everybody. Then we have data breaches and politicians scold everybody. I mean, I could go on, mate, but the Liberal National Party did all this stuff. And it's just, the last 15 years of it wouldn't be that much. The last 10 years of LNP government federally have not been good for the Liberal Party. They have not been business friendly. They've not been about small government. They've not been about low taxes. They have been pathetic. And if they want to win, go back to principles and live by those principles and have policies that they can sell to the Australian people. And that will get them re-elected.
And instead they put Susan in charge. Unbelievable.
Sad, but
I've
true.
got one last question.
Yeah.
I've got one last question for you, though. I should just leave it there because that's just perfect. But about you personally, after you've moved to the Libertarian Party now, you did run for Senate after that. You're out of this game anymore. You're still involved with it. What's the future for you? We're going to see you back.
I just don't have it in me anymore now.
Yeah,
so I'm 61 going on 62, and
you look great. It's the haircut.
I'm starting to sort of view every day is a precious day when you get to this age, and you think, well, how do I want to be spending my time? I want to be spending it in my business. I want to be spending it with my family and my hobbies and things like that. So no, but I don't mind striking a blow and participating in things like this, mate. So thank you for the opportunity.
Well, no, thank you very much for the time, and I hope you can get in the ear of some of the Liberals and some of the up and comers to learn from the expert about how to do it and what minds to avoid.
I don't think they want any advice from the likes of me, mate. But we live in hope.
It's a crying shame. Mr. Can-Do Campbell Newman, thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it, and all the best for the future.
Thanks, Damon, and thanks to all your viewers as well for watching.